So the talk, when we boil it down and look at it practically, the talk is all about happiness in daily living. In fact, that's all that is ever spoken about here. So I try to keep the talks practical, which means that what's spoken about is something that we can investigate for ourselves based on our own experience. And if we do that, if we keep it practical, then there's less chance of us getting lost in the mind again. The mind has a very good or well-developed habit of taking concepts and turning them into beliefs. And when the mind turns a concept into a belief, it tends to think that this is how life is. A belief obscures what's really here. So there'll be lots of concepts put forward. I don't stop talking. And whatever anyone has ever said is a concept. Don't take any of it as truth. No one has ever uttered a word of truth. But having said that, that doesn't mean that concepts can't be very useful. So if we keep going back to our own experience to see what the concepts are really pointing at, then each time we do that, we verify the concept for ourselves. We agree that it's accurate or inaccurate. And each time we see what a concept is pointing at for ourselves in daily life, it means the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And as the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, it uproots the misunderstanding that is in place. And the good news is that human suffering is an error. That's why the end of suffering is available. Suffering is an error because it stems from deeply ingrained beliefs which are mistaken. Essentially, we can say mistaken beliefs about who we are, what the other is, and what life is. And from that deeply ingrained set of mistaken beliefs stems all of human suffering. So, because I suggested that I try to keep it practical, the first question that is suggested to be asked, it's the most important question we can ask. In practical terms, based on my own experience, putting all beliefs and concepts aside, what am I really looking for in life? And if we're really honest, we'll answer that question with an answer. Now, don't take the answer and say, yes, this is the answer. Take it as a concept and investigate for yourself whether it's correct. The answer that I put forward is that humans have always been looking for one thing, and that is happiness for themselves in this life. And if we look at the movement of humanity, and if we look at our own movement in daily living, we'll see, based on the movement, not based on a belief, we'll say, yes, I'm moving towards happiness for myself. And when we look at this movement, we'll see that the belief must be that happiness for myself is to be found in outcomes, to be found in pleasure, to be found in circumstance. And that's the first error. That's the first, or the ground of this mistaken set of beliefs. That the happiness that I'm looking for is to be found in outcomes. That the happiness I'm looking for is to be found in pleasure. That the happiness I'm looking for is to be found in circumstance. So that's three ways of saying the same thing. Circumstance, outcomes, pleasure. This is not a belief that floats around in our head and we see it as a belief. It's a deeply, deeply ingrained belief that exists just above the core of who we are. doesn't quite go as deep as the core of who we are, thankfully, but it's very deeply ingrained. So these are all concepts, as I had said. So I've probably put forward 5 or 6 significant concepts so far. The last one is, our happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. The flow of life from the moment we wake up to the moment we go into deep sleep is only ever pleasure or pain. There's a concept. The flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain. Another concept. The human happiness is not to be found in outcomes, not to be found in pleasure or pain. So what is this happiness that we're looking for if it isn't happiness in outcomes? Happiness in outcomes is just pleasure. And from our own experience, we've got pleasure more than enough times in our life to understand that this pleasure is pleasurable, but it's short-lived, and it doesn't deliver continuous happiness. So, from our own experience, we can start to verify the concept. Happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. Happiness is not to be found in pleasure. So what is the happiness of the human being? It turns out that happiness for the human being is something very different to what we think. It isn't something gained. It isn't the addition of something. Happiness for the human being turns out to be peace of mind. Continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance that we find ourselves in. Meaning deep peace at the core of who we are, regardless of whether the flow of life is pleasure or pain. Now, this peace, regardless of circumstance, just simply cannot be present if the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure exists. If the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness, my completeness essentially, my completeness is to be found in pleasure, meaning when life delivers pleasure, I'm added to, and one day life will deliver enough pleasure, enough circumstance that I will be complete. And if that belief is in place, when life delivers pain, there has to be a reaction. It's an involuntary reaction based on this belief being in place. And the reaction is a reaction of resistance to the pain in the moment, because it's received as an attack on who I believe myself to be. And so when we hear that we need to accept, which equates to peace, accepting life as it unfolds, we often say, okay, I'm going to work really hard at accepting. We say this without understanding what the root of our non-acceptance is. And so if the root of non-acceptance, which is this very belief that my completeness is to be found in outcomes, if that root isn't weakened and eventually dissolved completely, then it's impossible to accept. So what we would have done is we'll set up a mental expectation, a goal, to achieve acceptance, when the very root of non-acceptance remains deeply ingrained. And so then whenever life unfolds in such a way that is painful, which is received as an attack on who I am, there has to be this resistance to what is. And then we see the resistance, which is non-acceptance. We blame ourselves or feel inadequate for not being able to accept life. And the cycle continues. So this happiness for the human being, this peace of mind, what is peace of mind? It turns out that peace of mind is simply the absence of suffering. Peace of mind in itself is not something that we gain. It isn't something from outside. It isn't even a feeling. Peace of mind is just the absence of suffering. This is why we hear over and over again, you're not going to get anything from this transformation. If the mind which is attached to pleasure, looking for happiness in pleasure, hears this, it often says, well, why am I here then? That's the part of us that doesn't actually understand what a gift that peace is. So, if the only thing getting in the way of peace of mind is the presence of suffering, and having asked this question, what am I really looking for? And maybe having verified, yes, the answer is happiness, but the happiness is not the happiness I've been spending my whole life looking for. The happiness is not out there in pleasure, but it's peace of mind. And we can check this out when we know we're unhappy in a particular moment. So if we're not even sure what this happiness is, we can start off with our unhappiness. In a particular moment when you can say, I absolutely am certain I'm unhappy right now, we'll see for ourselves that in that moment there is one of these 5 forms of suffering present. Either guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation or attachment to outcomes. Any of those forms of suffering, when we feel them, are going to feel like a deep uncomfortableness with oneself. Either an uncomfortableness with oneself or an uncomfortableness with the other, an uncomfortableness with life. But ultimately, an uncomfortableness with the other and an uncomfortableness with life equates to an uncomfortableness with oneself. And that's a feeling. We have to become familiar with this feeling of suffering. Awareness needs to land on it and say, this is my unhappiness. The feeling isn't the pain in the moment. The feeling of uncomfortableness is the suffering, guilt, blame, pride, worry or expectation, which turns out to be an attitude towards the pain in the moment. How we relate to the pain or the pleasure that exists in a particular moment. So let's look at this. That also, incidentally, is very good news. If our unhappiness was pain in the moment, then we can all pack our bags up, conclude that happiness for the human being is not available in this life, because it doesn't take much observation to realize that the flow of life is pleasure sometimes and pain at others. That somehow we've convinced ourselves that we might manage today or tomorrow to make life pleasure, 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 pleasure. But when we drop the investment in that belief, and that belief that I can make life pleasure, 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 stems from the deeply ingrained idea that who I am is dependent on pleasure. And so seeing life for what it is, being a flow of pleasure and pain, is just too hard for us to do. If we drop the investment in that belief and look at life, the flow of life, we'll see that inevitably it's pleasure and pain, pleasure and pain. We can't control what the other does. There are too many external factors for us to be in control of. And some of those factors are going to turn out to be out of line with our biological preferences. And when something is out of line with our biological preferences, then that's pain in the moment. So a simple conclusion is that the flow of life is always only pleasure or pain. And if my happiness was dependent on me having pleasure, 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 then that's it. We can conclude happiness isn't available. The good news, as I had said, is that our happiness is not dependent on pleasure or pain. Our unhappiness, which is what covers up our happiness, is suffering, which is our attitude to pleasure or pain, not the pain itself. The suffering arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation. if we look at the first three, guilt, blame and pride, they're all based on the deeply ingrained belief that I am the doer and that the other is the doer. Meaning that I'm in complete control of everything I think, feel and do. That I'm a separate entity with complete volition to do everything that I wish based on my own free will, and I'm in control of the outcomes. So when I see myself as a separate independent entity in complete control of everything I think, feel and do, I have to see the other as the same. A separate independent entity in control of everything they think, feel and do. And from that basis, and the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, when the other does something that hurts me, when the other does something that delivers pain to me or to someone I love or even a stranger, I have to see them as the sole responsibility of my pain, which is seen to be an attack on who I am, and I have to hate them. And that hate is blame, or rather that blame is hate. And under the heading of blame, we can have all sorts of different blame. You can have mild blame, you can have resentment, you could have hatred, jealousy, envy. And with that idea of ourself as the doer in place, whenever life unfolds through us in such a way that the outcome is painful towards someone that we love or even a stranger, or to ourselves, then we have to blame ourselves for what we did of our own free will that delivered pain to the other or to myself. And that self-hatred, that self-blame is guilt. And pride is based on the same principle that I am the doer, and pride arises in relation to those activities or those actions that deliver positive outcomes. And then this dynamic says, look what I have achieved. And even though pride doesn't feel as uncomfortable on the surface as guilt or blame, because it's in relation to outcomes that are positive, deep down, it's still a misunderstanding of who we are. And so it in itself is an uncomfortableness with oneself. And furthermore, it is the seed for the guilt and blame to arise as soon as the outcomes in life change from being positive to out of line with our preferences. So painful. As soon as the outcomes change from being pleasurable to painful, then there'll either be guilt or blame. So the suggestion in this teaching is that prior to the manifestation, prior to life as we know it coming into existence, source or consciousness was at rest in its unmanifest form. Absolute nothing. The absence of time and space. Consciousness not even aware of itself. An absolute nothing that the mind can't imagine. As soon as the mind tries to imagine nothing, it's turned that nothing into something. So this is a nothing even prior to the nothing that the mind can imagine. It's not an empty or dead nothing, but rather pure creative potentiality. Immense creative potentiality. And because it's potentiality, at some point it has to manifest. So consciousness at rest, the unmanifest, explodes into manifestation. We could say that the Big Bang, if that's a concept that we can work with, the Big Bang was that point where the unmanifest became the manifest, where pure potentiality exploded into actualization, where consciousness at rest became consciousness in movement. So source or consciousness or God is not out there looking in on what's going on, but rather has become the whole of the manifestation, the whole of time and space. And everything that unfolds from the beginning of time to the end of time is a creation of Source. Not a creation outside of Source, but rather Source has become the creation. And so everything in life unfolds exactly as it's destined to unfold. Exactly according to the story of life. A story that we're not in control of, a story that we didn't create, but a story that we're intrinsically one with, intrinsically part of. So if we use a night dream as a mirror down version of what I'm talking about, it might become easier to understand what this consciousness is and what the manifestation is that I'm referring to. So if we look at a dreamer or sleeper at night, a dream spontaneously arises out of nothing in the mind of the dreamer or the sleeper. There was nothing, mind at rest, and spontaneously in consciousness, because the nature of mind is consciousness, comes the manifestation. So consciousness goes from consciousness at rest to consciousness in movement. A whole world scene is created out of nothing. An ocean, let's say, a beach environment. Not there 1 minute and there the next. With dolphins jumping in and out of the water, seagulls flying across the horizon, people on the beach enjoying pina coladas, and the main character, the protagonist in the dream, walking down towards the water, walking into the water, feeling the crisp sensation of the water on their body, the sun on their chest. The world looks like an objective reality. The character, the main character of the dream, experiences themselves to be separate and independent from everything else that is happening, in control of everything that they think, feel, and do. And in an instant, the dream collapses into nothing, taking with it everything that has arisen in consciousness. So consciousness in movement returns back to consciousness at rest. So Ramana sums all of creation up, his ultimate concept. There is no creation, no dissolution, nothing ever happened. Referring to the fact that if life is a dream, out of absolute nothing, everything manifests as a creation in consciousness. And when it's finished, it collapses back into nothing. We start with nothing, we end with nothing, so really nothing ever happened. But mind you, for the character in the dream while the dream is happening, the experience is there. And who really is the experiencer of the dream? Or who is the experiencer of what is happening? Really, there is only mind in which the dream arises, consciousness. That consciousness of Source, the consciousness in which the dream arises, links to a particular body in the dream and functions through it as personal consciousness. Personal consciousness is the perspective from which the experience is seen. And so, in this analogy, we don't need to worry about the dream coming from nothing or going back to nothing. What we have to work with is being a character in the dream, living life as if we are the doer, but hopefully coming to understand that what we really are, the human being, is an expression of Source. The human being is essentially impersonal consciousness of Source, linked to a particular body, linked to a vehicle, and functioning through that unique vehicle as personal consciousness. And in each moment, the body is doing and thinking and feeling exactly what is destined to happen. Now, I said we'd keep it practical, and talking about life as a dream is not exactly practical. Saying that everything is happening according to God's will may not be to everyone's taste. So how can we look in a way that we can verify that I am not the doer? The suggestion is that in each moment the human being acts exactly the way they are designed to act. That means that in each moment the human being is one way, the way they are. And if we look at what makes the human being what they are in that moment, we'll find that it's based on two factors. Two factors that we've never been in control of. The human being on a biological level at least, the vehicle that acts and thinks and feels, is based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. And we weren't in control of the genes that we have, and we weren't in control of the up-to-date conditioning that life delivered moment after moment after moment. So each moment life delivers new conditioning. So these talks are simply new conditioning. New conditioning that will be added to our up-to-date conditioning. How it affects our up-to-date conditioning is not in our control, not in my control or your control. What is said is thrown out. I don't even know what I'm going to say next. That's new conditioning that life is bringing about, and how it lands, we only know after the fact. The new conditioning in each moment can add to the existing theme of our up-to-date conditioning, or it can radically change our up-to-date conditioning. So the deeply ingrained beliefs that I am the doer and the other is the doer, that my happiness, my completeness is to be found in outcomes, my happiness, my completeness is to be found in pleasure, is part of our up-to-date conditioning. Up-to-date conditioning that life has put in place. Up-to-date conditioning that forces us to act exactly the way we act in each moment. Forces us to act the way we're designed to act relative to the circumstance we find ourselves in. Now, the deeply ingrained belief in personal doership, which I refer to as an identity, hates to hear this. When it hears this, it fires up. This is not true. I am not merely a product of genes and up-to-date conditioning. It fires up because if what's being said is actually the death of that identity, if it accepts that, if it sees this, it's its death. But if this is heard by something deeper than the identity, then it resonates. And the same information that creates an uncomfortable response in one person will create an elating type of response in another. Oh, you mean I don't have to do anything? I've never been doing anything? I can relax? And when we look at the suffering, so if the belief in personal doership is firing up and saying, no, this isn't how life is, this isn't who I am, we just need to come back to this question again. What are we really looking for in life? And if we come to the conclusion, what I'm really looking for in life is happiness. If I drop all of the ideas, if I drop the idea that I'm looking for oneness with God or to find myself, or maybe we don't drop it, but I'll suggest, why are we looking for oneness with God? And we're doing that because we think when that happens, everything will be okay. So if we can accept, yes, what I'm looking for is happiness, let me drop my idea of how that's going to happen and just stick with the practical information that I can verify for myself. And we have a look at the unhappiness. that we can be certain of. And each time we verify the unhappiness, we'll find it's one of these forms of suffering: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So I'm not really trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just putting out information. Information that hopefully becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning, meaning that we understand it intellectually. The concepts are not really that difficult. They're delivered in simple English language. And so intellectually, we can start off by saying, I understand what's being said intellectually. So the suffering, when we look at it, will always be guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation. That's an uncomfortableness with oneself. And this uncomfortableness with oneself is known deep, deep down on an intuitive level not to be our true nature, not to stem from what we really are. It's very common, but it's unnatural. And seeking is a seeking for what's natural to us. And so when we look at the guilt, blame, and pride, it's based on the idea that I am the doer and the other is the doer. So if we're looking for happiness and we see that suffering is the error, and we see that the basis of the error is always the belief in personal doership, I'm the doer and the other is the doer, which allows guilt, blame, and pride to arise, and the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. That's as wide as our search needs to be. That's as wide as awareness needs to land. And if we keep the surface area that awareness needs to land on about that wide, then things start to change quickly. Because if the light of awareness lands and sticks to a particular area, then the lies, which means the mistakes, the errors, won't survive very long. Because under awareness, mistruth is seen to be mistruth. So if we focus on this suffering, which is suggested to be an error, and we ask ourselves when it's there, what is the basis of this suffering? We'll keep seeing it's always the attitude towards the other, the attitude towards myself, the attitude towards life. So meaning the attitude to the flow of life in each moment. That is an attitude where I see the other as the doer and myself as the doer, and my happiness to be found in outcomes. So I'll tell you a little bit about where a lot of this teaching comes from. So I speak from my own personal experience. I speak from the fact that when seeking started, suffering was part of the life experience. And when enough new conditioning came into the system to dissolve the false beliefs that were pointed at, the suffering ceased to be there. So I speak from my own experience of continuous unbroken peace of mind regardless of circumstance. But a lot of what I share are the very same concepts that Ramesh, my teacher, shared. And the reason that I share them in the same way, sometimes in the same words, is because for a long time I used to argue with him and say, well, why can't we say it this way? Why can't we say it my way instead of your way? And each time a process would happen where something misunderstood that was still in the system came out. And when it came out, I realized, I saw life different. That's why we say it this way. Because the concepts that he put forward were very well considered, very accurate. And so I share the same set of concepts. Now, Ramesh was a banker for all of his life. He retired at the age of 60 as the general manager of the Bank of India. And so he said, as a banker, I have to be practical. Know how to not be practical. And he had spent most of his life as a seeker. He was born into a Brahmin Hindu family. They had their rituals and their traditions and their family guru. And Ramesh recalls a story where one time he was on a Sunday at the family guru with all of the followers, and he decided to ask a question that he thought was very practical and relevant. And that question is, what will I have after enlightenment that I don't have before? Great question. The guru, because of the role that they played, got very angry at that question, or at least Ramesh said he could see anger arising. But before the anger was expressed, the guru noticed that a lot of other people in the audience were interested in the answer to that question. And so then Ramesh says, the guru gave an answer that you give when you don't really give an answer. The answer was, when you're enlightened, you'll know. And so for Ramesh, that was just another nail in the coffin that pointed to the fact that he had to investigate this for himself. So he started off with this question when he retired and he had time to devote purely to the search. He said he was going to do it for himself, put aside everything that he had been told before, and start with this question. What is he really looking for? He concluded, I don't really know what I'm looking for. I know I'm looking for happiness. I've been seeking for happiness in a certain place all my life, and it hasn't delivered the happiness I'm looking for. But what is the happiness I'm looking for? I'm not exactly sure. So he went to his unhappiness. He found his unhappiness was always in the form of guilt, blame, and pride, worry, and expectation. And when he looked at the basis of that and saw that guilt and blame is based on what the other does, he concluded it makes absolute sense to blame the other when they do something that hurts me. And it makes absolute sense to feel guilty when I do something that hurts the other. And he also concluded that it seemed to him that happiness was pleasure. That was the best that he had known up to that point in time. Concluded that life is pleasure sometimes and pain at others. And so after seeing this for himself, he felt comfortable to stop the search, having concluded that happiness for the human being is not available in this life. And when he stopped, just a few days later, he got a message from outside, as he put it. And the message was, Ramesh, you are wrong. It is the birthright of human beings to be happy. And the basis of that happiness is the basis of all religions, a basis that has been forgotten, which is why we've been having religious wars for thousands of years. Full stop, end of message. So, having had this, received this message from outside, which seemed like quite a profound message to receive for Ramesh, the search was reignited. And what he now had to do is find out what the basis of all religions were, in order to understand what the basis of human happiness is. And so one day he was looking through the Bible, and he came across these 4 words, "Thy will be done." And when he read them, he was particularly struck by them. And he had this sensation, this feeling that this is the basis of Christianity. And when he looked at Islam, he found that inshallah, God willing, also the basis of that religion. And then he knew Hindu, and he said it said the same thing in a more profound way. Thou art the speaker, thou art the listener. So with this new information that the basis of all religions, thy will be done, God's will be done. With this new information, how he sees himself and the other is completely different. That the other is just an instrument through which God's will be done. Meaning that in a particular moment, if the flow of life is delivering pain to someone, with this understanding, the pain can be seen as my destiny, The other will be seen as the instrument through which my destiny is being delivered. The other is not seen as a separate independent entity that is choosing to hurt me of their own free will. And on this basis, the hatred for the other and the guilt for oneself, the load of guilt and blame that we carry round, the load of pride, can suddenly fall away. And not only does the load that we've carried around for our whole life fall away, but it means we get to continue to live as this human being, doing in each moment exactly what we think or feel we should do, knowing that what we think or feel we should do in each moment is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning that I wasn't in control of, genes and up-to-date conditioning that are part of the creation, and therefore I still have the feeling of free will, the feeling that I am in control of what I think, feel or do, but with the deep knowing that everything that is happening is happening according to God's will. And from this place something quite special happens, is that God's will and my will are no longer seen to be separate, no longer seen to be in opposition with each other, that God's will is delivered in the form of the feeling of free will that we all have in each moment. And on investigation of my free will, my choice in the moment, what we find is that that choice is dependent on genes and up-to-date conditioning. I wasn't in control of the genes I was born with. I wasn't in control of the family I was born into, or the country I was born into, what political beliefs and systems were in place, what religious beliefs were in place, which school I went to, what friends I made, what events unfolded. And in a particular moment I find myself in a circumstance, let's say in a restaurant with a menu card, there are 10 options on the menu. And at some point one option is picked. So that is what we can call the process of decision making, the process of choice. So this is not saying that there isn't choice. Choice is the mechanism by which life unfolds. The story of life, which really is a spontaneous creation in consciousness, is a spontaneous creation in consciousness designed to unfold according to laws of cause and effect, designed to be a story in time and space, meaning that one thing leads to another. And so the unfolding of this story is an unfolding through the mechanism of choice. In each moment we have to make a choice. The choice we make turns out to be less my choice than I previously thought. And furthermore, the outcomes are never in my control. Sometimes I get what I want and sometimes I don't get what I want. So I might order orange juice off the menu, place the order with the waiter, understanding that it feels like my free will, which is great because I don't feel like a puppet on the end of the string. When I look at it, I find that it's based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning in that moment and the circumstance I find myself in. And once I place the order, I'm not in control of the outcome. Sometimes I get what I want and sometimes I don't. The waiter comes back and says, "I'm very sorry, but we've run out of orange juice. So no oranges, no orange juice for you." Or the waiter comes back with a nice glass of orange juice. Sometimes I get what I want, sometimes I don't. When I get what I want, it doesn't mean I was in control of the outcome. And when I drink the orange juice, it might be terrible, or it might be great, not in my control. Now, if we understand, so all of this sounds very intellectual, and on one level it is. These are all concepts that are being delivered by life as part of the story of life, based on, in this case, coming through me, based on the circumstance I find myself in and my genes and up-to-date conditioning. Which means I spent years being interested and curious, which was part of my makeup, reading particular books, and in the end finding Ramesh in Mumbai and listening to his teachings that sunk in deeply and profoundly and became part of my up-to-date conditioning, which is why the words are coming out the way they are. So on one level, it's all very intellectual, they're concepts. To be intellectual, because the way that life brings about change is through new conditioning. The concepts can be understood intellectually, and if they're understood intellectually, then awareness can start to land on exactly what the concepts are pointing at. So the concepts are not meant to be something that we keep in our head and think about in our head. It's the equivalent of me saying that in 10 minutes I'm going to ask you a question, and the question is, what is on the table in the corner of the room? And the person understands, okay, in 10 minutes you're going to ask me a question, what is on the table in the corner of the room? Yes, that's right. Okay, now here's the answer. There is an apple on the table in the corner of the room. And then I give more descriptions. The apple is sort of roundish and shiny, and it's got a stem and 3 leaves, and there's a wormhole and a worm coming out of it. And someone could be very satisfied with that answer. Great. When you ask me the question, what is on the table in the corner of the room, I have the information. And I say, okay, well, let me give you more information. And there's an apple on the table in the corner of the room. Right, yes, you've told me that. Yep, but there's an apple on the table in the corner of the room. Yes, you keep telling me that. Yes, but there's an apple on the table. So the point is that look at the apple on the table in the corner of the room. Having the information is satisfying to the brain, but it's not the point of the concept. There might be a pear on the table in the corner of the room. Now, the concepts don't usually say there's an apple on the table when there's a pear. They tend to be accurate concepts. But nonetheless, we need to really see for ourselves what is being pointed out. When we see the apple, we go, oh wow, it's that shape. I had a different shape in mind, even though you described it that way. I imagined something different. So when we see the apple, now we've seen something that we were imagining. And so all of these concepts need to be seen. And when we see them, which might not happen straight away, but when we see them, it's like, it's an aha moment. Ah, that's what it means that the flow of life is pleasure and pain. Because we might understand it intellectually. Yes, the flow of life is always pleasure and pain. If you stub your toe, that's physical pain. If you have a great ice cream, that's physical pleasure. If someone takes money out of your wallet, that's financial pain. If you go to book a ticket online and it's $300 today, and you say, I'm going to book that, and tomorrow you go and actually book it and it's $400, it's gone up 100, that's financial pain. If it's gone down 100, that's financial pleasure. If someone tells you you've done a fantastic job, that's emotional pleasure. If someone tells you you've done a terrible job, that's emotional pain. So the flow of life in each moment is only ever pleasure or pain, depending on your biological preferences. Part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning that you had no control over, I had no control over. So we understand it intellectually, and when we start seeing the stubbing of a toe in the particular instant, and that's pain in the moment. And when we eat a nice chocolate and we go, this is pleasure in the moment. It's the understanding is going deeper because the intellect is seeing it for ourselves in action. So an example that happened to me recently that shows this is several years ago I heard if you smile at a monkey, they're going to take that as a sign of aggression, which I found amusing at the time, and the explanation was you're showing your teeth to the monkey, and in monkey language that's, I hate you, I'm going to fight you. And when this was explained, it made sense to me. So intellectually I understood the concept. And several weeks ago I was walking in a part of India, and there was a group of monkeys, and there was a very baby monkey that hadn't been trained yet by its bigger monkeys, and it was very curious and was playing, wanting to play with me, and it was tiny and it had, very fine features. It looked like a mini human, really like a baby. And I had this really warm feeling in my heart. and I smiled at the monkey. And the monkey jumped back about a meter and screeched. And the mother of the monkey came rushing over, hissing, ready to fight. And so from my own experience, I had now verified the intellectual concept that if you smile at a monkey, it's a sign of aggression. I did it again today just to check. This was a bigger monkey, and instead of jumping away from me, it jumped towards me aggressively. And so now I have 2 verifications that smiling at a monkey at close range is a sign of aggression. And if I do it another 100 times, I can tick that concept off more and more convincingly, which means the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and it will uproot any misunderstanding that I have. Now, if it was very dangerous to smile at a monkey, what would happen is the first few times I did it, I would, let's say, get attacked. And as the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, it uproots the misunderstanding that says smiling at a monkey is showing them love. And I will probably stop smiling at monkeys as an unconscious movement, because the understanding from my own experience has uprooted the misunderstanding. And this is exactly the process that happens with spirituality. So if you find yourself contemplating life based on the concepts presented, contemplating it while living life, so you don't have to practice this for 2 hours a day as a special practice. The only practice is living life. This can be observed while you're walking in the street, while you're at work, while you're with your family members. It doesn't require life to change. What ends up changing is our attitude to life. When we realize that it's our attitude that creates our unhappiness, and what we're really looking for is happiness. It turns out that the happiness for the human being stems from a recognition of our connection to Source. So, happiness for the human being is the end of suffering. The end of suffering comes when the ingrained belief I am a separate, independent entity in control of everything I think, feel and do fall away. When I realize from my own experience that circumstance is not a determining factor on who I am. So the more that we rest in being, the more that we drop out of the obsessive thinking that is judging and comparing into just being, the more experience we have that life can be painful in a particular moment, and even when circumstance remains more or less the way it is, we drop into being and find, from this place, it's not so important. From this place, the circumstance remains more or less the way it was, but the relationship to that circumstance changes dramatically. Because resting in being demonstrates clearly what I am, and from the place of what I am, circumstance being painful is not so relevant. From a place of disconnection, running or functioning in life from the idea that what I am is something vulnerable that is dependent on circumstance, and primarily at the bottom of that is dependent on love. So the deepest attachment that we have to circumstance is the attachment to love. So deep down we believe that my completeness is dependent on love, love of the other. Once we realize by dropping into being more and more regularly that I am, here I am, complete, self-content, with no problems on the level of self, and from this place we know that the love of the other is simply pleasure or pain in the moment. Well, love of the other usually is pleasure in the moment. The withdrawal of love of the other is pain in the moment. So a combination of dropping into being, which happens more and more frequently when the thought processes that become clearly seen as errors are seen as objects that are not my doing, which really means a falling away of the identification with thinking. And from that place we find there is this field of being where I exist prior to thinking. And that place of being informs us very well that everything is a happening, not my doing. From that place of being, what I am is the witness to everything. The witness doesn't do anything. It becomes very clear from the place of being that the body is a biological entity moving exactly the way it's designed to move. And what I am is that which watches it all. Once that understanding is grounded and the misunderstandings that life has put in place have dissolved, we don't need to insist on remaining the witness. In fact, life pulls us out of being the witness. Life is not meant to be lived from the place of witness. Life is meant to be lived as if we are the body, as if we are the doer, as if we have free will, with the deep understanding which stems from our connection to Source in each moment, that everything is happening according to God's will. That way, I don't have to deny my Rogerness. I don't need to escape my humanness. It's not about the individual dissolving. The individual can remain very present. What dissolves is the belief in personal doership, the attachment to outcomes, the attachment to circumstance. So what we are is the ego. Ramana was the ego. We have an ego with the sense of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And when life undoes the deeply ingrained conditioning that life itself put in place, we end up with an ego without the belief in personal doership or attachment to outcomes. So the word ego here is being used very differently to how it was traditionally. Traditionally, the word ego is referring to what now is being referred to as the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. The confusion comes when we think we have to kill the ego, and it's the belief in personal doership that takes on that task. The belief in personal doership says, I have to kill myself. And when the belief in personal doership, I am the doer and I am going to kill myself, is in place, that entity never dies because it's got a mission, which means it's continually affirming its truth and its existence. So if we come to see that that entity, the belief in personal doership, is simply a belief system that was put in place by life, and it's life that undoes any beliefs by presenting new conditioning. This is new conditioning, so we don't have to feel pessimistic that we are not the doers. Life is putting us into these situations, even though we're not the doer. And so from this perspective, we can feel optimistic that life has taken us this far, and so why would life drop us now? It seems like when we look at the story of life is a story of forgetting oneself, a story of suffering as a result of forgetting oneself. And at some point, life starts to bring about a remembering or a dissolving of the forgetfulness, dissolving of the veil or obstacle that stands in the way of our being. And once that is dissolved, then life is the end of suffering. So this story of life from a spiritual perspective is consciousness forgetting what it is, identifying with something it can never really be, separate. So consciousness as the only one thing has created a playground in which there are many, identified with the many and forgotten that it's always connected. Suffering is a result of that, and at some point that error is corrected, revealing the connection to Source and bringing about the end of suffering. So remember, there's that microphone there, and if no one asks a question, I'll just have to keep talking.
Yes.
Hi.
Are you good?
I'm very good, thank you.
But it is about, see,
That seeking disappears with the seeking?
Seeking disappears with the seeker.
Yes.
I understand that point with the experience. My question is if you can share a little bit about when that experience happened to you and in what circumstance. That is the first question. And second, see, mind is always there. It is the mind who knows that now the thing has happened. So how long does it take, that doubt in the mind, and how long does it take for the confirmation, yeah, this is it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can share about that.
Right. So when we say mind is always there, it's good to introduce, or it's an opportunity for me to introduce another concept, and that is the concept of the working mind and the thinking mind. The thinking mind is the part of the brain and conditioning that includes the conditioning, I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in pleasure. And from that part of the thinking, or that part of the mind, which I'm referring to as the thinking mind, all suffering stems. And so that part of mind can dissolve, whereby it doesn't exist anymore, which really simply means the particular conditioning of the false beliefs, I am the doer and my happiness, dissolve. The working mind is always going to be part of the human being. The working mind is the part of the mind that is functional. It has conditioning in it, but conditioning that is not a problem to our happiness. Conditioning that doesn't disturb our peace of mind. So language skills, communication skills, mathematics skills, planning skills, knowing how much money to take on holiday, what time to organize the taxi to get me to the airport on time, what vegetables I need to buy when I go shopping, etc., etc. All of how to use a knife and fork is conditioning. So we are conditioned. It's a conditioned instrument that will always be a conditioned instrument. It's only particular types of conditioning that need to dissolve. Now, when you ask, from my experience, what was the experience that happened, it gives me an opportunity to address something that is often a mistaken belief, and that is that there is a particular experience that brings about a complete shift. And I understand why that belief is in place. There are experiences that exist that are very profound, experiences that are spontaneous, and experiences that seem to be timeless. So where time and space and the individual tends to dissolve. A oneness experience, a profound oneness experience, would be one of those experiences. That experience, of which I had several, is not as significant as we might think. It's not an experience where there is a sudden removal of all the deeply ingrained beliefs. It's an experience that demonstrates something. It's there in my understanding, based on my experience, and what I've heard and interpreted other accounts of these sort of experiences. It's there to reveal, to show something that's not readily recognizable in the ordinary life experience state. Once those experiences happen, they tend to fade away. And so even a oneness experience is an experience. The quality of it feels radically different. When it happened to me, I went to visit Ramesh, and I was convinced it wasn't experience. It was outside, it was the falling away of experience, because my definition of experience was duality, subject-object relationship, and this all fell away, and it felt like this was reality. What had been experienced was reality. It took several months for me to realize that was just an experience, meaning that was an experience. All of life is always an experience. It was an experience that was designed to be felt and experienced exactly the way it was. In other words, of oneness, let's say, of the absence of subject-object relationship, to show something. It showed that what I am in essence is untouched by the flow of life. So it was a profound recognition that if someone were to come and hack my arms off, it wouldn't touch who I was. Now, that was revealed in the experience, but then we come back to daily living. I don't want anyone to come and hack my arms off, incidentally. That will be extreme pain in the moment, and what was revealed is the essence of who we are in that experience. What my mind concluded is, this is it, this is enlightenment. And now I just have to wait for the experience to come back and be there on a continuous, unbroken basis. And I went to see Ramesh, and he saw me and he said, "Oh, hi Roger, nice to see you. What brings you here?" And I said, "Well," and I described this experience in very precise language, because at that time I was looking at life very much as if I was consciousness. So I was very familiar with the language that suggested otherwise, and I described this experience. And after waiting patiently for me to finish, he said,
describe that.
I couldn't do it any justice now, because frankly those experiences mean nothing of significance to me. And at the time, all of the details were very present. And after having this particular discourse with Ramesh, something very significant happened. He said to me, "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." Now, it was extremely profound. It was more than, it's not that it didn't play a significant role. But when he said that, none of what he said rang true. "Roger, don't worry about it. It's just an experience." So I described it again a second time, just in case I missed anything out, because it didn't seem like he understood what I was describing. And he waited again and he said, "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." And so I felt like he hasn't understood. So I tried again, third time, "Roger, don't worry about it. It's just an experience." And at that point I concluded, well, actually maybe he doesn't understand. Maybe it hasn't happened to him. And I left India not particularly satisfied with that answer. And as I continued to live life, going on my morning walks, it had happened on a morning walk, and each time I got to the place I was waiting, taking my steps to get under the tree and it wouldn't happen. And at some point I became, because I was very familiar with the different forms of suffering, became very aware that I had an expectation that was leading to suffering, and the expectation is that enlightenment will look very much the way it was described in certain non-dual teachings, like that I have great respect, and they are completely essential as part of the process. And I became convinced that the words in those teachings were absolute truth. And so when this experience happened that mirrored the words I was reading precisely, experientially, I became even more convinced that this is what is available. Until suffering started to arise, and luckily I had enough intellectual understanding, which means my intellect was able to assess the situation. And I said, this is suffering. Where's the suffering coming from? The suffering is coming from the idea that enlightenment is going to look a certain way. And then Ramesh's words came back, "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." And I said, what if he's right? This is the first time that I even considered 1% that he could have been correct. But when I saw my suffering based on an expectation, based on my conclusion that stemmed from this experience, what if he's right? And then I went back to the understanding was in place. I'm looking for happiness. Happiness is simply the end of suffering. In that experience, there was no suffering, that was clear. But in my life experience, up to that point, there was very little suffering. This suffering had now kicked in. And it occurred to me, this is the suffering. This waiting for something, thinking that it looks like something, is now suffering. And so it became very clear, what I'm really looking for is to be able to live life as the human being with the absence of suffering. And this is new suffering. So from that point on, a whole lot of spiritual concepts about oneness, which was very present in my life because witnessing was a very present component of daily living, feeling like I was formless awareness in which everything was arising, that particular experience was a much more crisp version of the witnessing that was there much more persistently, which was a more subtle version of oneness. From that point on, a whole lot of ideas about the personal dissolving and being the impersonal fell away. And the experience of life changed, whereby peak experiences came to an end. And that wasn't at all a problem, because what came with that was more peace and a recognition, this is what I'm really looking for. So the second part of your question is, when does the mind recognize that this has happened? And for me, the answer is when we become really clear of what enlightenment or this transformation is in practical terms. The end of suffering. Buddha made it very clear. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. So if we become really clear that in practical terms, this search is going to deliver the end of suffering. As long as suffering is present, the sensible part of the intellect, the working mind, can see that suffering and saying, this suffering is based on a false idea of who we are, a false idea of who I am. It doesn't need to judge it. As soon as it judges it and makes it personal, that's going to be more suffering. So having the concept that this process delivers the end of suffering can be a dangerous concept to have, because if the belief in personal doership grabs hold of it, it will resist suffering whenever it arises. If the working mind has this concept that enlightenment is the end of suffering, it doesn't insist that that is delivered. And when suffering arises, it can just see there's suffering because it must be coming from one of these false beliefs. And that's all. It can then allow the suffering to be there and not create more suffering. To the extent that in our own experience, we see that life unfolds, pleasure sometimes and pain at others. And even when it's painful, suffering doesn't arise, then the intellect can draw the conclusion, suffering is not part of my experience. What I'm really looking for is the end of suffering. So what I'm looking for has been delivered. It might actually be 6 months after the end of suffering has happened that the intellect looks back and say, on this basis, my life hasn't included suffering. Even though circumstance has been painful at times, people have still not done what they said they were going to do, or haven't done what I would like them to do. I haven't become a perfect human being. That it still rains on days that I want to go out and have a picnic. The food that I order is not always to the standard that I want. So life is still very much pleasure and pain, but we find that our attitude changes such that there isn't a resistance, as if it is a determining factor of my completeness or who I am. We still might resist the pain in the moment biologically. So acceptance doesn't mean that we sit by looking at the burst water pipe in our house saying, well, it's all predetermined and I have to accept. We accept that it's our destiny for the water pipe to have burst. Biologically, we do whatever we can to fix it, knowing the outcome's not in our control. And so I hope this answers the question, in that you can look back and it can be, for the last 6 months, suffering hasn't arisen. So then the conclusion is, it must have happened sometime sort of 6 months ago, which shows that what happens is actually a very gradual dissolving of the deeply ingrained beliefs. So the times when I'm sure many people have the experience that you can witness suffering, whereas previously there was a complete involvement in the suffering. And the witnessing of suffering is not what it appears to be. It appears to be like awareness becoming more aware, let's say, or awareness developing. So now that I'm able to witness suffering, what in my estimation is that the suffering is getting weaker. It's no longer as deeply ingrained as it used to be, and the fact that it's got deeper means that the primary suffering will still arise, but the secondary cause of suffering, which is the belief that I have done wrong, that the other has done wrong, and so therefore judging the suffering that is arising, that is no longer there. And so it's a gradual process.
So you mean there's no point of transformation? It is a gradual process?
If someone asked me, I would say it's almost definitely a gradual process, and within that gradual process there are events that are unique in their nature, that are spontaneous and seem like they are not processed, because they are events that at their base are timeless, where the sense that time exists, because certain objects fall away in those experiences, the sense that time exists falls away, and so those experiences, when we don't relate to them as experiences, seem like they are different to the rest of the process. And they're a little different, but they're actually still a continuation of the process. And so when people talk about, let's say, Eckhart Tolle's transformation, they go off stories that have been, and what people say, and so they hear it and then they go, oh, this is it. To me, it's very surprising that people say that his was an instantaneous transformation. From what I understand, he was quite a scholar and very interested in the subject for many years. He had a lot of suffering that was driving his seeking. So before his event, there was a whole lot of contemplating and new conditioning coming in the form of spiritual texts. And so what I believe the story is, on one night he was suffering intensely, which was regular for him, but this night it was particularly intense, and the thought arose, I can't live with myself. And then another thought recognized what that first thought implication is. Oh, there must be two, me and the one I can't live with. And that created a click, where he went into this vortex experience, the timeless experience, let's say, and then woke up in the morning, and as can be the case in these experiences, because it's an extension in a way of the experience, he describes how he sees everything differently. So now a drop of dew, I think it was, is caught his attention, and he'd never seen anything so beautiful. But then after that, if I'm not mistaken, he spent 5 years sitting on a park bench. And then when you look at the book, the wonderful book that was presented, A Power of Now, the whole content of the book is about the pain body and witnessing. There was no witnessing of the pain body before this event. There was just the pain body, so he was very familiar with that. But I suspect that the 5 years sitting on the bench was a process of integration, where a lot of things were coming out of the body, being witnessed from a different perspective to previously. And so, and I'm sure that if this was the case, he wouldn't have any issue. I don't imagine that he has any investment, spontaneous event that the world thinks happened, if given the opportunity. And I don't know his teachings particularly well, but maybe he's described this. There is the 5 years would be a very different experience to what happens when the integration has been complete. So awakening is spontaneous, and then deliverance is a gradual process after awakening. And deliverance is the process by which the suffering becomes less and less and less, and the awakening is a significant event that shows us something about ourself and about life that we didn't have before, a package of information that becomes crucial in undoing the remaining false beliefs. And prior to the awakening, there was a process also, a process of weakening or strengthening the ingrained beliefs, making suffering less or more. And in Eckhart's case, it seemed like it got so bad that that's what pushed him through. It can be the other way, where it gets lighter and lighter and lighter, and then an experience happens. But I wouldn't say the experience is categorically significant as a end and start point, but it's going to be different for everyone, so I'm not speaking for everyone. Just use it. Can you just turn it on?
Yes. Eckhart told that all this occurred within the peace that came that night when everything happened, that never left him.
Mm-hmm.
Only that.
Yeah. And so there is a significant point. I can speak from my experience. There's an understanding that happens at some point that doesn't change. And when I look back in my process, somewhere in 2002, I guess it would have been, this shift happened, but it didn't seem particularly significant to me at the time. And then 3 years later, in 2005 sometime, a really profound oneness experience happened. And that would be the experience that people would like to hear about, that profound oneness experience. Because if you describe the sensation, the makeup of the state, it can sound appealing. In hindsight, I look at it and I say, what happened in 2002 was much more significant than what happened in 2005. And in 2002, sort of the falling away of seeing the body as the subject. Because I believed the body to be the subject, and at some point it became apparent that the body is an object, and that the subject is prior to the body. So, life was lived whereby the body was the subject and everything else was objects. And at some point when it became clear, the body is an object as well, like all the other objects. But it was a very subtle, slow shift. And at that point I thought, this can't be it. It didn't seem, but that was the point where it was never seen differently again. So in saying all of this, what I guess I'm trying to point out is that it's, in my experience, the thing that seemed very definitive in hindsight was less important than something that happened before that was much more subtle. And I'm sure it's going to be different for everyone. So the point is to not have some fixed idea about what it looks like.
Hi. What I'm suffering through, most of the time, is a kind of emotion. So let's say when I wake up, especially when I wake up in the morning, there is a deep feeling of sadness. There is no reason behind it, just feeling of sadness deep down there. But when I look into it, and I don't find any particular reason of doership. I'm being doer, other being doer. That is the reason behind that sadness or expectation in the life. But it's still there, and that is somewhat causing me suffering. So how to?
Sorry.
So how to deal with?
Right. So I'll give you some explanations. Why it tends to happen in the morning, according to, this is all based on my experience, so it's not absolute, right? Is at night, the systems in the body, the defense systems that we have put in place to keep this uncomfortableness down at a place where we don't feel it very much. So we've got a lot of defense systems that are at play during the day. At night, those defense systems don't work as well. And so a lot of what's in the subconscious comes up into the conscious. And that's sort of what dreams are. The dreams are a reflection of what's in the subconscious coming into the conscious. And when we wake up in the morning, that energy is still flowing around. It hasn't, and it takes some time for it to get pushed back by the body's defense mechanism. A cup of coffee is a good start to pushing it back, let's say, for some people. And it gets, we don't want to sit with it at all. So, and it falls back into place. And so after half an hour, people feel, okay, that's a bit better, maybe. So what is being felt stems from a root. And so you're feeling the sadness, let's say. The sadness, in my estimation, comes from this deeply ingrained belief of personal doership that existed in relation to an event that happened sometime that was very painful. Very painful and related to, by the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, exactly that way. That you hurt me, I hate you. You hurt me and I'm extremely sad that you hurt me because it means I'm not good enough, let's say. That's why you hurt me. So the hurt is the pain. The perpetrator of the pain, let's say a brother or a father or a teacher or a stranger, becomes the doer. So the pain is their doing to me, which is an attack on who I am, and we feel it's all personal, and there's that trauma. That event is traumatic, and it's related to, from personal doership, it gets locked away deep in the cells of the body. And the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome is contained in that energy packet. And so because it's there will be, throughout the day, a underlying sense of discomfort. Particularly in the morning, because more of it could be there. And the job that life has to do is a job of bringing awareness to what the root of that feeling is. So as awareness becomes aware of the feeling, with the understanding that pushing it down is what we've always done unconsciously. The body has decided, well, it feels uncomfortable, so it's got a strategy of how to suppress it. That strategy is not a good strategy. It's the best that we've got at this point in time. So when life says new conditioning, that's not a good strategy if we're looking for peace of mind. Peace of mind means the uprooting of that ingrained belief system. So now we have the motivation or the rationale on which awareness can be interested in feeling that sadness rather than suppressing it. Well, awareness doesn't normally suppress it, but other parts of the biology do. Now there's a reason that when we see us distracting ourselves, which is the suppression, the working mind can kick in and say, no, this is not the solution. Now we have, we've become very good at witnessing. Witnessing is really, which is, in real witnessing, there isn't a witnesser. The doer isn't the witness. That's why when there are teachings that talk about witnessing, at some point they have to bring in the notion, who witnesses the witness? There is no one that witness. There's nothing beyond the witness. But when the thinking mind takes on the notion of being the witnesser, then a teaching needs to say, and what witnesses the witness, which it's not really talking about the real witness, it's talking about the ego witness. When real witnessing is happening, there is no witnesser, just witnessing. And that's very profound because it reveals the nature of the aspect of consciousness, which is awareness. And when the thinking mind gains the idea that I have to remain as the witness all the time, it then turns that into a technique. It turns it into something to do. And witnessing is a bit like breathing. It comes and it goes. And as I think you've described, when this uncomfortableness kicks up, one of the defense mechanisms is to escape into witnessing. Now, there are this other suggestion, which is put witnessing aside for a while. and feel. Really feel. Because when we witness, what happens is the suffering tends to dissipate and we don't get to feel it. It tends to dissolve, which shows the nature of suffering as not absolutely real. It shows the nature of self, that is that which is prior to all of these things that arise and that which is not touched by these things. So there's a great value in resting in being and witnessing happening. But when it comes to what you're asking, we need to also get some conditioning that says it's okay. In fact, let's put witnessing aside. Let's put peace of mind aside. And let's feel. Why I say put peace of mind aside is because when we feel these energies, we have to feel the complete unenlightened attitude towards life that was put in place back then. Meaning we have to feel the hatred, we have to feel the grief. We have to, when I say we have to, it's like feel it and curl up in a ball if that's what it makes you do, for the feeling to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And then crying might happen, or shouting might happen, or hitting might happen. This is not something for you to do. It's not a technique. It's not someone that it's not okay, from 6 till 8 I'm going to sit down and feel. It's simply new conditioning that suggests that if that feeling comes up and you know that it's hanging around for your life and it's not the best, the way for it to be transmuted is to feel it and to express it. But we also have to understand just expressing these feelings doesn't transmute them. When they get transmuted is when they are released, not just expressed. If you just express these feelings, what can happen is we see the hatred that's inside, or remember the event, and then we can hate the person even more. That gets released when we start seeing life differently on a day-to-day basis. So once we're seeing life from a perspective of non-doership, understanding that the other person is a biological instrument based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning that they weren't in control of. So they are an instrument through which destiny is unfolding, exactly the way it was destined to unfold. Very different to how the person back then related to the event. So now, with this understanding, especially understanding that what's coming out is just energy, just belief systems, a belief system that sees life inaccurately, but we need to honor it, right? Feel it for what it is, allow it to be there. Effectively, you're expressing and releasing what ideally would have been expressed and released back then. But when I say ideally, it wasn't possible back then because the person was different. Now, this doesn't necessarily need to be limited to your life. These events may well have happened in some other life, not your past life. You don't have a past life. Roger only exists because of this body. So Roger has never lived before, and Roger will never live again. When this body is gone, Roger has no capacity of being here, because Roger is a combination of impersonal consciousness, this body expressed as personal consciousness. But it seems, I speak from my own experience, that these memories of another life arise. Where do they come from? It wasn't my life. It was a life that was lived. Many lives have been lived. The belief of personal doership was put in place. When that life dies, or when that body dies, it seems like a packet of information doesn't die with it. A packet of information gets stored somewhere on the cloud, let's say. And in my explanation, that packet of information includes the unresolved fears, unresolved desires, unresolved talents, and insights that have happened in those lives. And then if you want to break the idea that there is a soul, because this is just a packet of data, not a soul, you can say that all of those packets get, let's say they're plates of glass, and they all get broken into little pieces and mixed into a big pot. And then a new birth is given a handful of these unresolved and also insights. And then that becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning. So that, to me, is the explanation of where these energies come from. either from an event in your life or an event in another life that has existed, that gets carried forward. And in this life, as those energies are released, they're no longer in the body. When they all get released, we find the body continuing to live life, experiencing life as it unfolds moment after moment, pleasure sometimes, pain at the other times, but now no longer with the identity of personal doership in place, neither on a deeply ingrained unconscious level or on a conscious level. Life is seen to be destiny unfolding. My connection to source, meaning that I understand whatever happens through the human being, any movement, any speaking, any senses, is only there because the consciousness of source is functioning through me as awareness and the sense of being. And when the body dies, that's the end of this experience, the personal experience. And if we're deeply connected to source, meaning that there is an understanding that what I am doesn't die with the body, that the impersonal consciousness of source just retracts back to where it came from, then death is not seen to be an attack on who I am. And that only is the case when that set of energies that block that connection get released.
There was one more question, if I can.
Sure.
There are actually two questions. One is Nisargadatta Maharaj.
Is that on?
Nisargadatta Maharaj used to give mantra also and I am meditation also. So like you were with Ramesh, so you got a mantra from him?
Did I say that Nisargadatta did mantra?
Mantra.
But I said that, or you're saying he did mantra?
No, did he give it to you, Ramesh Balshikar?
Give me what, sorry?
Mantra.
No. No, that wasn't, mantra is not part of this teaching. That would be a different path. A different path will have different methodology. What I say about mantra is that...
No, because I am very connected with Nisargadatta Maharaj lineage.
Mm-hmm.
So from Nisargadatta Maharaj, they like Ramesh Balshikar and Ramakant Maharaj. So, and Nisargadatta Maharaj talks about the mantra. And I am meditation, these two were the things he used to talk about.
Yeah, but you know what Nisargadatta said about the question he was asked by one of his disciples as to how he wanted his samadhi to be. His response is, so samadhi is the gravestone of the enlightened sage. And he said, why would I want a samadhi? So that dogs can piss on it? And so his attitude is that he didn't see himself as an extension of a lineage. And if someone asked who his guru was, he would give the answer, Siddharameshwara. But for him, it was very clear that it's not about defining certain things. So he may well have given a mantra, but Nisargadatta started off as a bhakti to his guru. And he, as I understand the story, he said, my guru told me to abide in I am. I trusted the guru. I did what he said, and after 3 years there was self-realization. And Ramesh would call Nisargadatta his guru. But Nisargadatta said to Ramesh, you will not parrot my words. And Ramesh's teaching is very different from Nisargadatta's. I went to visit Ramesh because I thought I was going to be exposed to more of Nisargadatta's teaching that I was immersed in for several years. And when I heard that Ramesh was a translator of Nisargadatta, out of respect for Nisargadatta, I went to Mumbai for 2 days stopover. And when I got there, Ramesh was saying something completely different. I had a conversation with him, And in the conversation, he understood that the non-dual revelations had happened, and I had first-hand understanding of that part of it. And so he asked me this question when we were talking. So I think I must have said something typically non-dual. He said, so who is talking to who? And I said, well, we could say consciousness is speaking with consciousness. And Ramesh said, Roger, don't be ridiculous. Roger is speaking with Ramesh, and Ramesh is listening. Ramesh then speaks to Roger, and Roger listens to Ramesh. And I couldn't understand what was happening here. It's taken me 4 years to realize there is no Roger, and there is no Ramesh. And here I was sitting in front of a teacher that I thought was in the lineage of Nisargadatta, and here he's telling me that I am Roger. Nisargadatta I had spent 4 years listening to I am consciousness, you are not the body. So I thought, I've come to the wrong place. At first I thought this was kindergarten spirituality that was being spoken of. Very quickly I realized it was far from that. It was what was needed after the certain understandings had been put in place. So as I relate to mantra, the question, who am I, for example, or I am, some people have said, oh, I've done who am I for weeks, and they say, who am I, who am I, who am I, who am I, who am I? And so when someone says that, that's not self-inquiry. That's just repeating a word that they probably haven't even, or a series of words, that they haven't even really understood what is the question. So, abide in I am, as I related to it when I was reading the teachings of Nisargadatta, meant something very particular to me. It was the recognition that when the thinking mind is functioning in such a way that there is this attachment to the future, regrets in the past, all of the beliefs in personal doership, seeing the other as a competitor or an enemy, someone that can take something away from me. The thought I am arises. The thought I am includes all of the wisdom that we've come to understand intellectually. The wisdom that recognizes this thinking as not useful, this thinking as the barrier. And then the thought I am becomes a bookend to that thinking. It cuts off the thinking. And if we then drop into being, drop into the heart with an open gaze, in that moment after I am, the thought arises. We can, I am. That's the I am after the thought I am, the being. So if I ever suggest this repeating of the thought I am, it's always not something that a practicer does, but something that happens spontaneously once awareness lands on the obsessive thinking that we have now come to register as suffering. And once awareness lands on it, the cutting off is the thought I am, which becomes the last thought before we drop into being. Mantra can be very useful, I'm sure, at occupying the mind, so that the mind can't think of any other thoughts. So that would be a different methodology, a different practice, not one that typically is part of a jnana yoga path. But then again, everyone's path is different. You could have someone who's half jnana yoga and half bhakti, for all I know, and so they use mantra.
Yes, and can you please speak more about destiny? Because as you said that Ramesha was having a very practical approach, so can you please give some practical approach towards destiny, because it seems very impractical?
If someone says, can you explain how life is destined, in such a way that I can see it practically rather than just believing that life is a story according to consciousness? Well, one, from the perspective of profound insight, let's say, the fact, or not the fact, but the recognition that everything is arising in consciousness, unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, becomes something self-evident. But if those insights are not part of someone's path, and they don't have to be, it can be unfold differently, then a practical explanation makes more sense. And so if we look at a little bomb exploding, if a little bomb explodes, the initial impulse, the initial explosion projects all of the shrapnel outward along a certain course, and the shrapnel will bump into bits and pieces, into pillars and statues and whatever's there. And after everything has finished moving, everything is at rest. And the shrapnel ends up exactly where it's destined to end up, based on the initial impulse and everything else that is part of that initial impulse. So if we look at the Big Bang, if we want to see that as the origin, if we're looking at it practically, then we have to go to science to say, okay, this is, if we're looking at things based on cause and effect, look at the initial impulse and see that all of life is this big movement outwards from that initial shock wave, that initial impulse. So just like a series of dominoes, when you hit the first domino, the outcome is already determined. The last domino is going to hit over the ball bearing that will end up in the cup. And so once the first impulse happens, everything else is a series of cause and effect. And so the end has already happened. And so we can look at a pool table, billiard table as an example, and it's got the red balls in a triangle shape up one end and the white ball up at this end. And before we hit the white ball, we have a computer simulator next to us, and we input into the computer simulator how hard we're going to hit the white ball and at what angle. And then we press simulate, and the computer moves the white ball into the triangle of red balls, and all the balls move out and move around. And when all the energy is expended, the balls rest in a certain position. And if we then go to the physical pool table and hit the white ball at exactly the same angle with exactly the same force, what will happen is all of the balls will move around exactly as the computer simulator said they would, and they will come to rest in exactly the same pattern as is on the computer simulator. So what that says is, if there's a closed system that is based on a set of physical rules, that the initial impulse means that everything else is just a chain reaction that happens after that. What the human being has trouble understanding is, because there's this belief that I am a separate entity, the chooser, that is unconnected to anything else, unconditioned by anything else. So there is this belief that I am the doer as a separate entity. It then says, well, this isn't a closed system because there's this me that is unpredictable. But once awareness lands on what we think the me is, and see that the me is actually part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, part of the closed system, that thinking is part of physics, it's a movement in the brain, neural network, electromagnetics. So the thinking is not the product of an individual, but a product of the biological instrument, the brain, which is part of the body. And so once all of human decisions are reduced down to biological reactions, which are causal, then we can see, wow, what an amazing unfolding this life is. Not something that a computer could ever predict, because it's got far too many variables, but the principle is the same. That there's an initial impulse, and that puts the next situation in place, and so on and so on.
Good evening, Mr. Roger. Uh, it all sounds like a deja vu for me because from the first question he said about this insignificant experience, I had it yesterday. It's insignificant experience that Roger was saying just now. I had it yesterday. And it was not only me, 4 of us, Mr. Joe, Mr. Piao, and Nilesh. Okay? So I'll tell you how it happened actually. I just like to share about this experience, alright? So we were in Laxman July having a small satsang, you can say a small satsang, alright? So when we're having an intense conversation, alright? So this is what happened. We realized thinking mind was never in the picture at all.
Which mind?
Thinking mind.
Thinking.
The thinking mind was not in the picture at all. So it was with a strong conviction I can say that it was the essence of life was seeing everything. Alright? And then the vision that we had, it was expanding and it was very beautiful. Alright? It was a
Put together.
yeah, yes. All 4 of us were sitting together. Alright?
But it happened to everyone or just you?
It happened to every one of us. It's a very beautiful moment. Okay? Okay, after we had all this experienced, okay, and then me and Nilesh, we had a long walk together back to hostel. Alright? And then the mind was asking back, why can't it happen again? And again and again. Okay? It couldn't happen again. Alright? So it was a small, insignificant experience like what Roger said. And then again I met Joe and it had happened again. Okay, it was just a two essence connecting to each other and there was nothing else. And with such a strong conviction I can say that it was just essence of life. There was no thinking at all. There was no mind picture at all. The first time of my life I had this kind of experience. So as what Joe said, why can't last longer, or just maybe then Roger said it was just a gradual process, or maybe that yesterday in satsang he said that when I asked this question, this what do you call, who am I, and thinking back, and I entered into a sudden emptiness, and then he said, do not expect further, it will unfold it by itself. So it unfolded yesterday night actually. So it was a small insignificant experience that I had yesterday and today 2 p.m. I think.
If you allow, can I speak something?
Sure.
I had that laugh exactly.
See, the word experience, which, okay.
I use the word experience because there is no other way to use things than words, right?
Exactly.
But what I exactly meant is an experience where the experiencer gets finished, no? There's no experiencer. There's no experience, and that experience I'm talking about. And see, in the case of Sadhguru, it happened, right? In the case of Eckhart Tolle, it happened. Yes, it happened. In case of mine, it happened, I can tell you. So that is what I was asking. So yeah, it is okay. You can say that it is insignificant experience, but there is a significant experience which is needed. An experience without an experiencer. Okay, that is what. Like what I think, to end the suffering, sufferer has to be finished. Otherwise, there is no end of suffering, because sufferer will find out suffering anywhere. So if there is no sufferer, there is no suffering, and that's what nothing is.
Yeah.
Otherwise, sufferer is there, he will find it out. He
So
will make
but-
suffering out of happiness.
But what is the sufferer?
The sufferer is the experiencer. The ego stands in three forms. Either it is a doer, as you said, either it is a thinker, or either it is an experiencer. So the ego has to be finished, and ego has to be utilized then. Ego was never there, in fact. But you just know it, that it was never there. And then you live the same life.
So then who lives the same life?
You, me, he, everybody.
So what dissolves?
Huh?
So what changes? What dissolves?
Nothing changes except the knowing. When Ramesh asked the question to Nisargadatta Maharaj, that what is the difference between an enlightened person and a person who is not enlightened.
This was a different guru, right? That had it
Or
wasn't-
maybe different
yeah.
guru, but the question, because when somebody is enlightened, he knows that he cannot claim that enlightenment, because everybody is enlightened, right? When it is said that aham brahmasmi, that I am that, there has to be then another sentence that you are that too, tattvamasi. Aham brahmasmi, tattvamasi. I am that, you are that. So, what was I talking about? Yeah, so sufferer has to be, vanished. And it was never there. You just realize that. You cannot even...
So in the teaching here, that sufferer is defined as the belief in personal doership, that I am the doer, and therefore I have to make things happen. I have to feel guilty, and I have to blame. And once that is seen to be false...
No, I is the false, so everything is the false around.
Yeah, well, I mean, I understand completely where you're coming from, because these are the conversations that I had with Ramesh. Absolutely convinced that the non-dual understandings and experiences I had were a reflection of truth, were a reflection of the enlightened state. And when the various conversations had an effect that I didn't expect, I ended up on the floor at his feet crying, because I realized that what I thought I knew was not as accurate as I thought. And in that moment, I felt about this big. And what revealed itself was that I had a whole lot of ideas that were put in place by the non-dual teachings that are very profound teachings that have to be part of the process. They show us the illusory nature of life, the illusory nature of self. Ramesh's whole teaching was, I am that, living as this. And the this is the sense of I am Ramesh. The realization is that the I of the I am Ramesh is the I of Source. And so we have to, at first, the experience has to dissolve the Rameshness to reveal the I of Source on its own, the impersonal I am. But that, the assumption is that one day, and it's, it's a funny little search, this one. It takes us down lots of little twists and turns. But at the end of the day, the benchmark for me is peace of mind in daily living. If peace of mind in daily living is there on a continuous, unbroken basis, and even if it arises and it falls away without remaining, then who cares, right? So, assuming that there is more or less peace of mind, then nothing more to say. No, not even no self-doubt. If we go to the experience, anyone who then says, yes, but compare it to the teachings of so-and-so, I say, I've forgotten about those teachings. They're not relevant to me. I don't even have my own teaching that's relevant to me. What's relevant is the peace of mind that exists. And then whatever happens after that, whatever flowers after that, in each moment is not necessary, because everything is fine as it is. And if something unfolds beyond the peace of mind in daily living, it's a bonus. So I would always go down to the practical life experience. And what I found very fortunate for myself, because I had this stubbornness in a sense, is that there was always this thought that arose, but peace of mind is still eluding me to some extent. There is still suffering in place. And when the suffering was seen to be in place, I would say, so that means you're not quite on the money yet, which was what kept me open to listening to what Ramesh was saying. Whenever I got too argumentative, the thought would arise, have you got complete peace of mind? No. Complete peace of mind, or the absence of peace of mind, depends on some misunderstanding still being in place. And so I said, oh, I have a misunderstanding in place. And when that stopped being the case, when peace of mind was there, then the assumption, without it being a belief, is that, the misunderstandings have been cleared up. And if suffering were to arise again, then I would ask the same question. What is the misunderstanding in place that is leading to this suffering? And to the extent that there's no suffering, then we have no questions. So we've gone a little over time, which is not really a big problem, but so as not to keep everyone beyond the suggested time, we'll call it a day. I appreciate the questions. These are the questions that, or the statements even, that deliver the most value to people listening. So thank you. Mm.